Welcome to this tutorial by Contract Scheduler on how to build an estimate in Primavera by cross-loading resources and materials. So let's look at our resources library first, okay? We come over here and I've already preloaded some resources. We have a plant equipment operator, mechanical operator, carpenter, quality control inspector, safety monitor, forklift operator, laborer, and if you notice, even a forklift, which is not a person, but it is a resource that we will be using. So let's go under our tabs here and we can see how we've set up each resource. So for plant equipment operator, if we go to our general tab, you can see I have a resource ID, PEO, which matches up here for a resource ID, PEO. Resource name is plant equipment operator, that matches. I can put in an employee ID and a title, an email address, an office phone. But in this instance, we're using a generic resource, so I'm not really interested in having to have a specific ID or a title or an email address. But if you were to load an individual's name, you would probably have that information in there. And if you notice over here, I have this clicked off, active. That tells me that this resource is in fact still active. If someone had retired or we no longer need that resource, we would just deselect this box. You don't want to get rid of the activity because then you'll lose your history if you have past schedules that have that resource in there. So now let's look at the codes tab. In this case, I have codes for department, location, classification, and plant. This just makes it easier if I want to do a search for a type of resource, and I can do a filter by department, location, by the different codes because of the way we have it set up here. Next, I go to details. Now, if you notice for here, for the plant equipment operator, the resource is a labor resource, and I'm using US dollars. And in this case, if this plant equipment operator were to exceed 8 hours per day, then the overtime factor is 1.5. So that's how much overtime you would pay that individual if you have them scheduled here and they exceed their daily allowable work. Over here, calendar. You notice it says trades, 5-day work week. In this case, I know that this 5-day work week is an 8-hour day. And this is a calendar that's assigned to the specific resource. This is different than a calendar that would be assigned to a task, okay? So just keep that in mind. Now, if I drop down here to forklift, I want you to see the difference. When I come down here to forklift, in this case, it's not labor, it's considered non-labor. It is not considered material, and it's not considered material because we're not using it up over the course of the work that's involved here. So in this case, it's non-labor. So that's the difference that you would see there. Let's go back up. Units and prices. If you notice, this was effective on the 1st of January this year at midnight. It says max units per time. Now this is important because it tells you what's the max number of units, or in this case, what's the max number of plant equipment operators that we have available to us on a daily or shiftly basis, okay, by the calendar. And if you notice it says 12 hours per hour, that means we have 12 plant equipment operators that are available. This is very important when we get into resource allocation, so just keep that in mind. We'll go back to it. And then standard rate. A lot of companies don't like to put the specific rate associated with a resource because that is considered confidential information. So you might have to use a generic or an average rate to give you a good idea of what it would be for that position. Okay, so you notice that's in there. Roles. In this case, the role here is operations. This can be used as a help when you go to assign resources. When you look at an activity, you can assign by a resource or you can assign by a role. So it's just another way of filtering, basically. And then we have notes. Okay, so we've done that for each of these people. So let's look at, just for example, mechanical operator. When we look at units and prices, I just want to show you here that for mechanical operator, this is 10 hours per hour. So that means we have a maximum of 10 mechanical operators available to us on a shift. Carpenters, we have a maximum of 9. Okay, this will just come in handy when we move forward. So now we're going to go look at our schedule, okay? So we have our resource library. That's very important. You want to make sure you have that built, and you have to have the dollar amounts or the rates tied to the resources. Otherwise, you're not really going to be able to do your estimate. So we go to activities here. And I've already pre-built a schedule. In this case, what we have are two heat exchangers, an alpha heat exchanger and a Bravo heat exchanger. We're going to do them in series. So we're going to do one and then the other. And we'll go through and I'll show you how I have assigned the resources, which then allowed us to go ahead and calculate our estimate. In order to do this, I made some initial conditions, some assumptions. Okay, one is that I used generic resources. I did not use specific people. If you need to use a specific person, it's very important that you keep that in mind when scheduling, when it comes time to whether it's going to be a task or resource dependent. Okay, so all of these I use generic resources. Now, since I use generic resources, if we come over here to the General tab, and you notice down here, it says task dependent. The difference between a task dependent and a resource dependent activity is that a task dependent activity is going to use the task calendar. So we're going to use a calendar that is associated with the project, that's associated with the specific activity. Now, again, if I were using a specific person, that person might be on vacation for 2 weeks. So you might want to change it, and it would be based on the resource. It'd be resource dependent, because in that case, you want to be able to know when that individual is not going to be available. So, but for this example, since I'm using generic resources, I have used task dependent. The next assumption I made or condition is that there's a 1-to-1 ratio between, if you look up here, our original duration, okay, our duration, and then how many hours were budgeted per person. What that basically means is that, say, for example, here we have an 8-hour duration activity. So for the entire 8 hours, whatever resources I have assigned to this activity will be working specifically on the activity. They'll be charging the entire 8 hours to this activity and to this project, okay? So that's what we mean by 1-to-1. The difference would be is, let's say, your child has an assignment from school, and the teacher gave that your child 1 week to complete the task, the homework assignment. But the reality is that your child's only going to need 3 hours maybe to complete that assignment. So your child's going to have 3 hours budgeted, but the duration would be an entire week. So that's the difference between a duration and what's budgeted. But in this case, every hour that a resource is assigned to a particular activity, they will be charging their entire time to that activity. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is our duration type down here. Notice I have fixed duration and units per time. This is very good for when you're trying to do an estimate. And the reason why it is because it allows the cost to adjust as the assignments are added. So when we're building an estimate, it is good to use fixed duration and units per time. The next initial condition or assumption that I'm using is percent completion type is going to be physical. Okay, if you notice you have options here. You can be duration, physical, or units. If we had duration, and let's say this activity is 8 hours and you're 4 hours into that activity, if you have duration, it's going to assume you're 50% done. Physical is reality. When you're talking to the field, when you're talking to the supervisor, or you're talking to the people who are out there doing the work, they're going to tell you what the physical percent complete is. Because even though this activity is 8 hours, for example, the first 2 hours, they are really, really busy on that, and they will get up to 40% complete. And then it sort of slacks off. And then as they progress, then they'll pick back up again. So your physical percent complete is not going to be the same as a linear completion. Okay, so those were the assumptions that I made. And if you, again, task dependent means we're using the task calendar. Resource dependent means we are going to use the resource calendar. So as I mentioned, this particular project is going to be about, we're going to take a heat exchanger out of service. We're going to replace some tubes. We're going to do a flush, and then we're going to return it to service. And then we're going to take the next heat exchanger out, and we're going to do the same thing, okay? So our first activity, if I go under the alpha heat exchanger, and you notice up here I have a start milestone and a finish milestone, okay? And if we were to look at them, I don't have resources assigned to them. I'm just using these milestones so that I can get a high level feel for when this project will start and when it will finish. So our first one here, transport materials to the heat exchanger. If I come down under my resource tab, if you notice, I have a forklift, right? Our non-labor resource. We have a forklift operator, and then we have laborers. If I come over to this budgeted units per time, if you notice for forklift, it's a 1-to-1 ratio, 1 hour per hour. That means I'm using one forklift. For forklift operator, it says 1 hour per hour. That means I'm using one forklift operator to operate the forklift. However, when I come down here to labor, if you notice it says 2 hours per hour. What this means is that I have 2 laborers assigned to this task. You notice it's an 8-hour duration, okay? And then I come down here, and if I have 2 laborers, the budgeted units goes up to 16. Because what that does is the budgeted units is going to determine what our budgeted cost. So it's taken into account that I need 2 people that are going to be assigned for 8 hours, for a total of 16 hours, and a cost of $480. Now, the way to change that, if you notice, if I highlight in here, I can go to 3. And you notice now my budgeted units goes up to 24, and my budgeted cost went up. So it will automatically calculate. Let's go back to 2 here. But this gives you an indication of how we can change the number of resources. So when you go in there and you add the resource, see down here, add resource, I can add the labor, and then I'm going to go into the budget units per time, and that's how I'm going to change how many resources I need based on working with the team, reading the work order. Maybe I've already worked out in the field for a number of years, and I come in and now I know how to schedule this, but you want to be able to allocate your resources here. Okay, so that takes care of transporting materials. If we notice that's an 8-hour duration, and the cost rolls up because I have my budgeted total cost, and it's over here. Okay, next one is going to be scaffold build. In this case, carpenters. If you notice it says 3 hours per hour, that means I'm going to have 3 carpenters for a duration of 4 hours. So budgeted units goes up to 12, and that's going to calculate our budgeted cost. And I come down here, what do I need? I need 2 laborers, right? 2 hours per hour for 4 hours, which is going to be budgeted units of 8, and it's going to do the calculation. So if you notice, we have 2 scaffold builds, one at the north end and one at the south end of this heat exchanger, where they have to go ahead and build scaffolding in order for the workers to be able to access. If I come over here, expenses, now for materials, what I did here is I added it under the expense tab. And the reason why I did this is because I don't want to use a certain number of resources per unit time. So I put it under the expense tab. If you add, so you can add an expense right here. So you can manually add that in there. I'm going to go ahead and delete that back out. So this is a free-form field, so I typed in scaffold materials. Cost account. I had options on the cost account. In this case, it's the work order number that we are going to be using for this heat exchanger. If you need to add a cost account, you come up here to Enterprise, Cost Accounts, okay? And then you can add. So those are your options for being able to put the cost account. This comes in handy when you want to do reports. You notice here, expense category. I used materials. I have options. It's another code. So I have a list here. Now, if I need to add an expense category, that's under admin, admin categories, and then expense categories here. And if you can see, I have a drop down, so I can go over there and add. Now, you might need admin rights to be able to do that. So they may be already preset for you. You may not have to do anything with that. Accrual type. In this case, I did uniform over the time of the activity. If you can see, I have options between end of activity, start, and uniform over the activity. I chose uniform over the activity because I'm going to be using the material over the course of the activity. And so if I were to do a snapshot midway through, I would like to see how much the cost is during that time. And then budgeted cost. So here's my budgeted cost is $3,000 for this scaffold. If I come down to the south end, the scaffold material is going to be the same. If the scaffold was a lot more complicated, then that budgeted cost might be higher. But that's how we set that up. I come back over here, resources, but it still takes me 3 carpenters and 2 laborers, right? 3 hours per hour and 2 hours per hour, 4-hour duration, and it's going to calculate our budgeted cost. Next activity. So we're going down here and showing you, now everything's going to have a predecessor and successor, so it's extremely important that you make sure that you have your logic ties set up correctly so that everything flows and you have your critical path, so you're not distorting anything. So the next activity is going to remove the end bells. In this case, I only need a mechanical operator, and then notice it says 2 hours per hour. So 2 mechanical operators for 4 hours for budgeted units of 8, and that's going to give us our budgeted cost. Next, safety watch. Now I want to show you for the safety watch, this individual is going to be present the entire time the job is ongoing. So I have start with the end bells, because at that point the safety watch has to be on site, and the safety watch cannot leave until after we've done a fill and leak check of the heat exchanger. Okay, so it's finished with that activity. So I wanted to show that in there. Another thing, sometimes people like to use a level of effort for an activity like that. In this case, I did not. I used a task dependent, and the reason why I did that is because if I use a level of effort and I assign the resource, the cost information, this budgeted cost, will not be available and will not roll up, and I need that to roll up to our budgeted total cost, okay? So I just want to explain why I did not make it a level of effort activity. The next activity is to replace 30 tubes, and I put a note in there, there's 1 tube per hour, okay? So that tells me right here I have 30 tubes. It's going to take 4 mechanical operators, right? Mechanical operator, 4 hours per hour. I come over here in my expense tab, because what I have are heat exchanger tubes, our cost account, it's materials, uniform overtime, and $45,000. So I did calculations, and it's going to be $45,000 budgeted costs, uniform overtime, and that is going to be for 30 tubes. So we can go all the way down here. I have clean and flush the heat exchanger, and those with cleaning materials for this one. And the resource is going to be 4 mechanical operators. We have a QC inspector who's going to come out on site and do a check before we can continue. After that's done, we're going to replace the flanges and reinstall the end bells. So we have 2 mechanical operators that are going to do the flanges. If I come over here, expenses, that's where I have my flanges allocated here with the cost account, materials, uniform over the activity, and a budgeted cost. So just to review, we do a fill and leak check, we remove tags and place in service, and then scaffold removal. Now, one thing to note here, if you look at the expense tab, I don't have materials here. I do have resources, right? I have 3 carpenters and 2 laborers who are going to remove the scaffolding at the north end and also in the south end. The reason why I did not have materials under expenses because they're removing the same materials that they used to build the scaffolds to begin with. And we're also going to take those materials over to the Bravo heat exchanger. So we don't want to double charge the cost, okay? We've already taken into account the cost of those materials. So we don't want to, it's almost like double dipping. You don't want to count it again. And then they're going to clean the area around the heat exchanger. And if we look at our tie, once the scaffold is removed, then if you notice, I have an activity that's going to take me over to the Bravo heat exchanger. So if I go there, and then basically we follow the exact same format with the Bravo heat exchanger. We're going to transport the materials. We're going to build a scaffold. Again, I'm not going to charge for a scaffold. I do want to take into account the resources, but not the scaffold materials. So we built the scaffold at both ends, one after the other. We're going to remove this heat exchanger from service, hang the tags and drain the heat exchanger, remove the end bells. We're going to replace the 45 tubes. And remember, in parallel, we have to have our safety watch, right? So I have that activity in there. And I'm just going through activity by activity by our relationships. We're going to clean and flush, do the QC inspection, replace the flanges and reinstall the end bells, fill and leak check, remove the tags and place in service, and then we have to basically remove our scaffold to clean up the area. We want to take that into account, right? Because that is, we do have resources that are working, even though the job is done, we still have to do cleanup and everything. We want to take that into account with our cost. Now notice all the way down here at the bottom under this WBS, it says administrative. Well, we took into account the people who are out in the field who are working and getting this all done. But what we haven't done is we haven't taken into account that we do have people who support the project, however, they are not out there. So it's like overhead, your administrative support. So what I did here is, for this one, I did make it a level of effort. Notice here, level of effort. And I included these resources under the expense tab. So there's multiple ways you can do this. This just happens to be the way that I did it. But notice I have cost analyst support, project coordinator oversight, and scheduling support. And typically what happens is you just basically make an assumption that, for example, a scheduler is going to use about 2 hours per day, maintaining the schedule, doing updates, finding out what's going on, making reports. So 2 hours per day, the scheduler is going to charge against this project. And notice their cost account is a different cost account so that we can keep everything straight. I made the expense category administration. It's uniform over the activity. And then the budgeted cost, so I put that in there. And what's nice about doing with the uniform over the activity is this entire project takes about a month, and you'll see every single day there's a set amount for admin that is being charged to this project. And that's why I wanted to make sure I had it uniform over the activity. But again, I wanted to let you know that I did make this a level of effort activity, and I put the overhead or administrative resources under the expense tab. So that takes care of our schedule. So basically what you're doing is just assigning your resources, but you want to make sure you take into account all your resources. You want to make sure you have included any cranes that might be necessary, any vehicles that might be necessary. You can charge those if they're going to be used for this particular project. Like I said, the materials, forklift, in this case we had a forklift. So take into account anything that you can think that's going to contribute for this project, and it's going to be a cost, because that's going to help us build our estimate. And when you have your resource library and you have those costs assigned to that, you can see that it automatically fills in the data here. So let's go up here and look at my columns. I have an activity ID, and I like to use a smart ID. So I use the work order number for each heat exchanger, and then I put a hyphen, and like MAT is material for me, SE is scaffold erection, and it's at the north end, scaffold erect at the south end, hang clearance. So make those activity IDs work for you. We have an activity name. We have our original duration, remaining duration. So as we progress, we can see what our original duration was and then how we are tracking if our remaining duration is accurate. Start, finish, baseline, start, and finish. Once you have built the schedule and the entire team has reviewed it and it's been signed off as being complete, you want to create a baseline. Very, very important to create a baseline. So come up, project, maintain baselines. And you notice I have one built here already. I like to help with the name, so I put the date and then 072620, that's the date, and the fact that it's heat exchanger tube replacement and flush. And if you notice, I even made a baseline type. It's the initial planning baseline. Those are just little tools to help me know what type of baseline it is, okay? And then once we have created the baseline, come up here and you want to assign. And if you notice project baseline, I have it selected, okay? Very, very important. If you're going to go on and do earned value, it's extremely important that you have your baseline set once you have created your schedule and you have set the budget. Variance. In this case, the variance, let me come up here, I'll show you with my columns. In this case, with the variance, I use the baseline project finish date. So if I see a delta or difference, a variance between, in here, it's between the finish, the baseline finish and the actual finish. Percent complete, remember I used physical percent complete, but I just changed the wording to make it a little bit shorter here. So it's percent complete, and then budgeted total cost, and then actual cost, which I just changed the name to say earned cost to date. Okay, so those were my columns up here. The other thing I want to point out is if you look over here with my WBS, I set it up in a way to make it useful for me to roll up those costs once I assign resources to each activity. So I have the heat exchanger, the alpha heat exchanger, the Bravo heat exchanger, and then administrative. Because if you look at the schedule, remember when we were looking at this, it just made it so much easier to see the summaries roll up to the WBS level. So I can look at the alpha heat exchanger, I can look at the Bravo separately, I can look at administrative costs, and then the total all the way up here at the top, okay? And to make that work for you, if you come up here, you want to go to your group and sort. And when you go to group and sort, this is where it says show group totals. You want to have that selected. You want to group by WBS, and I indented because I only really have a couple of WBS levels. If you had about 4 or 5, you may not want to indent, but I just want to point that out. So WBS level. And then my sort, I went by start in ascending. So under each WBS grouping, I want it to be sorted by the start date in the ascending order. Okay. So I've explained the WBS, our columns up at the top, our group and sort. We've assigned resources to every single one of our activities. We've accounted for our materials by going to the expense tab. We have our administrative costs in there. So we have all of the information, and you can see we did roll up, and we have our budgeted total costs is $173,870 to perform both of these heat exchanger, tube replacement, and cleanings. Okay? So the next thing we're going to want to do is we want to be able to go to different layouts and look at our information. We need to send out reports, right? So we're already on the layout that shows this estimate. So I'm just going to come up here, right, to print preview. And this is our standard view. I think most people are familiar with this. We have our activity detail over here on the left, and then we have our Gantt chart over to the right with, I kept the logic ties in there because it's not too busy of a schedule. If you start adding multiple projects and then you have inter-project ties and everything, it can get a little bit too busy. But in this case, I do have the ties showing in there, our critical path. If we go over here, page setup, you can see a page. I put a tabloid because I usually need as big of a page as I can get. If you're in a particular like a room or something where you want the project to be up there, maybe out on a plotter. So that's all depends. And we can set our margins, header, footer. One thing I want to point out, just a reminder, if you are going to put a picture in here, you want to put your logo or something, come up here and you want to click on here. This will allow you to insert a picture. You're not doing a copy and paste. It seems like you would just be able to do a copy and paste in there, but you can't. You have to be able to go to that picture, okay? And then over here, options, and you notice we have activity table, all columns, grid lines, and Gantt chart. So this is just your standard schedule, and it goes down onto the second page. You can see it plots out nice and neat so we can see the entire project, okay? So that's just your standard layout. The next one I want to go to is I want to show just a separate heat exchanger. So let's change our layout, and I've pre-built mine. What I do is I build them and then I like to save them, and you may want to do that too with different layouts just to make it a little bit easier so you don't have to change your layout every single time. Okay, so this layout is for, I just included the alpha heat exchanger. However, if you look at my filter, if I come down here, I'm going to show you something. I wanted to include the admin costs. So in the filter, I have the alpha heat exchanger, WBS, and then admin. So I wanted to include both of them in the cost because they're spread out. The admin costs are spread out over both heat exchangers, okay? The other thing I want to show you is that on the bottom, I changed this. So show on bottom, okay? And you're going to come down here and you're going to look at your activity usage spreadsheet. That's where you're going right here, activity usage spreadsheet. And that's how I got this bottom portion, okay? So when you do that, now it's going to default over here, the bottom right, to certain different fields. But if you want to change it, come here and you see I right click in the bottom right, spreadsheet fields. And in this case, I have cumulative, budgeted total costs, and budgeted total costs. Once we start progressing this schedule and we're working it, I would probably add the cumulative total actual costs and actual total costs, because I want to be able to track that in addition to budgeted. But right now I'm just sending out the budgeted portions, so I only have those two fields. And as you know, you can just come over here and we have all these different options. So you have different options of what you can have in your spreadsheet. But like I said, I only kept it to the minimum. And so for each activity, it's going to say what the budgeted amount, what we've budgeted for that activity, and then over time, how it accumulates, okay? Now, if we come up here, I'm going to see a report. And if you notice, I'm only looking at the spreadsheet, because if I come over here to page setup and then to the options tab, the only thing I have selected is spreadsheet. That's it. Now, if I came here and I selected activity and Gantt chart and spreadsheet, now I have the entire project up above and then the spreadsheet down below. So it's really, think about what your client or the project team, what they need to see, and then do your reports accordingly. But so if they just want to see, in this case, for each activity, and then how much was budgeted, and then over time, in this case, it goes by day. See, it's per day. I can see what the budget amount per day is, and then the cumulative, the total until the activity is complete, and then the budgeted and the cumulative total should be the same. And then down here at the bottom, notice administrative support. And it even includes the weekends. However, we're not working on the weekends. So if you notice, there is no budgeted, you're not seeing it budgeted on the weekends. If we had a 7-day work week, then you would see budgeted on the weekends. So we can do the same thing with the Bravo heat exchanger, but that just allows us to look at the cost flow over budgeted cost, budgeted cost flow over the time. Now, so that takes care of the money portion. Let's look at resources. So our next layout is going to look at resource allocation. So if I come here, I want to see our resource spreadsheet. Now, this looks a little busy, but it will be clear here shortly. To get to the bottom portion, you're going to go to Layout, Show on Bottom, and you're going to go to the Resource Usage Spreadsheet. So not activity, but resource, right? Because now we're looking at per resource per activity. So that's how I get to the bottom. But if I come over here to the left, now I already have this set up. Display, I just want to look at current projects resources, because it will default and you'll see all the resources, but I really only want to see resources that are assigned to the specific project. Okay, and I have them all highlighted. Okay, I can go one by one, but in this case, like I said, I highlighted all of them. And then over here where it says display, notice how it will tell me how many plant equipment operators per activity that has a plant equipment operator assigned to it. So you can see how it plays out over time each day. However, if I'm just looking at total, I'm going to come here, display, collapse all. And I have this really nice spreadsheet over here. This is basically a spreadsheet to tell me how many resources that I need of each resource over here per day. Now, you're probably wondering, how do I get this for and everything? Well, because we have more than one plant equipment operator, I need to go in here, right click in the bottom right, and I have to go into Spreadsheet Options. And I have to go in here and I need to change the calculation, okay? In this case, what I've done is I have assigned 8. So I've already put that in there because they're working 8 hours per day. So if they were working 10 hours per day, I would change it to 10. So it's very important that you make sure that you have your spreadsheet options correct. And then what that takes is the total number of budgeted hours. If you know, remember budgeted units, I have 2 operators for 8 hours. It's at 16, so it's going to take that 16 divided by 8, and I get 2. So that's going to make sure that you have your resources calculated properly. Okay, so that's coming down here, bottom right, right click, Spreadsheet Options. Once we have that done, let's come up here, print preview. And I have the schedule up above. And if I come down, then you can see down here at the bottom, it tells me all my resources, right? Because I highlighted them and I collapsed the fields. And then I made sure with my options that I divided by 8 so that I made sure that I just showed per day. And it will tell me for each particular day how many resources I need of each type over here. Okay, very, very important. This helps us when we're allocating our resources. And if you have multiple projects and you need to ensure that you're not over allocating resources, you want to make sure you have all those projects open and then do the same thing, right? Select all of them, highlight all of them over here, collapse the field, divide by 8, and it will tell you how many people you need each day in a particular skill set. Okay, and the way we got there is all the way over here, options. And if you notice, I have activity tables and Gantt chart and spreadsheet. A lot of times you want to be able to see your schedule and then down at the bottom per day, be able to see your resources. You can just look at your spreadsheet and it would tell you per day. So you can do it that way too. It's all personal preference. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at a layout now that's going to show us almost a histogram. So it's going to show profiles. And this is going to really show us if we have over allocated. So we're going to open, and again, I've created a layout already. It's called resource profile. Okay, so I have resource profile here. The way I get there is layout, show on bottom, and then come in here, resource usage profile. That's how you get there. Now, if you notice, all of them were highlighted, which we could do that. See, all of them are highlighted. And notice how this bar is up here at 400 hours. Okay, that's because if I combine all of them together, then that's how many hours per. But usually when you print out the histogram, we're just going to highlight one. So plant equipment operators, right? So this tells us with our max. Remember in the resource library when we had max units? So if it's in the case, let me see, like mechanical operators, 8 hours per hour, so 8, we have a maximum of 8 of them, then that's why a bar chart, it caps at the top right here. And as you can see, we are only using, we're not maxing out our allocated resources, so we're doing okay. But that's what you want to do with each one of them. You highlight quality control inspector, safety monitor, forklift operator, our laborer, and then forklift. Notice with our forklift how we've used all of our resources because we only have one forklift and we're using it for, on that Wednesday, we're using it for the entire 8 hours. So if I come up here, let's say plant equipment operators, and I want to be able to print this out, let me go to print preview. And you can see what I did is if I go to page setup and then over to options, the only thing I have selected is profile. And what you'd probably want to do is change your header or footer to mention that this is for your plant equipment operator resource allocation. So those are different layouts that you can use and how you get there. There are 2 standard reports that Primavera has generated nicely for us. And so if we go to over here, notice reports. And the first one we're going to use is AC02. So I'm going to scroll down. See report group costs and it's activity costs. So click on run, report, and then print preview. I usually like to look at the print preview before I do anything, send it to the printer because you might have to change your page size, right? So I come here and I know that it's not all on one page because of my arrow coming over here. So I'm going to go to page setup. And I think if I go to legal, I should be good. And there you go. So now it's down to just 3 pages. What's nice is that it has it broken down by activity. Heat exchanger alpha. And if I go down, you'll see Bravo. Okay. And if I continue to page down, it even has the admin. And it's going to have our budgeted total costs, actual total costs. So once we start progressing, we're going to see how much we've actually charged for that particular activity, what's remaining, and if there's a variance. So it's going to tell us if we spent more money, if that task took more time, and so there was more time charged to that activity than what we had budgeted. It's going to let us know how we're doing and how well we planned. And then if we do this particular project again, which more than likely we will, then we can use this as a guide and tell us whether or not how well we plan. So this is one standard report. Okay. Now I'm going to come out of there and I'm going to go to the next one. And the next one, let's go down a little bit more. It's SR04. Right click, run, report. And this is schedule report with activity budgets. You can see it's a little bit, let's see if we can make it just a little bit bigger so you can see it. It's a nice spreadsheet. It all fit on one page. It does go by activities again. But what's nice is it's going to tell you budget at completion, earned value. This is going to be useful, right? It's very important. And earned value, to do that, you want to make sure that you have a baseline so that you can compare your actual schedule to your baseline. And it's just a nice, like I said, nice report on the budgeting and earned value for each activity. Now you can create your own reports. There may be generic reports that the company has already generated. So there's many options. I just like to show you which ones I think in here that Primavera already built that is a useful tool. So we can go back here. You can see it's really no different than building the schedule. The only difference really is that making sure that you have cost rates associated with each of your resources, that you make sure you remember to include your materials, that any overhead, so you really get a good estimate for the job. And then we showed some different reports and layouts that you can use to get some good information. Hopefully this did help you. If you would like to provide us with feedback, we always enjoy hearing that, or if there's any future subjects that you would like to hear, that you would like for us to present, please contact us at info@contractscheduler.com. We do look forward to hearing from you, and thank you for your time.